Okay, our moderator today is the director of Venus Global. She earned her bachelor degree in mathematics and computer science from University of Adelaide, Australia. She completed her Master of Education from Flinders University, Australia. And as Fulbright Scholar, she completed her PhD at the Graduate School of Education in University of California, Berkeley, United States of America. Please join me to welcome Dr. Diah Wiyardini.
Halo, selamat pagi. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Okay, all right then. So I think we will just start now, right? And I would like to invite. Should we all sit here, right? Okay. So I think I would like to invite our two speakers today. The first one is Dr. Asti Widihastuti. So, Ibu, would you please come here? And the second one is that we have Miss Levana Sani. So again, in this morning sessions, we will have two speakers. All right. So today, so I think I would like to describe a little bit about this event. So every semester, this is our regular event. Venus is conducting or arranging what we call a Venus Festival. So in Venus Festival, we organize a lot of seminar series, and then of course we also invite speakers with the organizations that like sort of the scope of the organization covers international communities, and then the aim is actually to again of course to provide international experience to our students, so that our students can actually have like a kind of a global mindset. Yeah, and then it is also a part of our university vision, that our new university vision is to foster and empower the society in serving and building the nation. Yeah, okay. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Asti Widihastuti. Right, and now I would like to read a little bit of your CV. So she has, I think about, 6 pages of CV. So I'd like to summarize it in a few minutes. So Ibu Dr. Asti Widihastuti, she graduated from the medical school in Samratulangi University, Manado. And then she also completed a master's in health counseling from the School of Public Health from the Curtin University of Technology, Perth, Western Australia. And Dr. Asti is an expertise in training and facilitation on various contemporary development issues, with specializations on the intersections of public health, reproductive health, and HIV, sexuality, and gender. Yeah. So Ibu Dr. Asti Widihastuti has also been working in several international organizations, such that the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and then also in UNICEF. And then the most current one is in the UNFPA, or actually the abbreviation actually stands for the United Nations Population Fund. Yeah. Okay, so without further ado, Bu, so the stage is yours.
Turun sebentar. Okay, good morning teman-teman. Shall we do a little warm up? I will do like a short energizer, and I will invite you all to repeat after me. So it's very simple and easy. So it's called tepuk semangat. How to do it is like this. You you can all see me first, and then you can follow after me, okay? So, tepuk semangat. Dang, dang, dang. Ding, ding, ding. Dung, dung, dung. Dang, dang, dang. Ding, ding, ding. Dung, dung, dung. And then we do this. Set. Aha, aha. Set. Aha, aha. Set. Okay? Bisa semuanya? Okay, let's stand up. Kita bisa lakukan sambil berdiri. Okay, everybody stand up please. And join me being short energizer for the opening, so that we don't feel sleepy afterwards. Okay, tepuk semangat ya. Ada dang dang dang, ding ding ding, dung dung dung, and then we repeat it all together, and then do the set and move your body a bit. Ya, tepuk semangat. Dang dang dang, ding ding ding, dung dung dung. Dang dang dang, ding ding ding, dung dung dung, set, aha aha, set, aha aha, set. Okay, thank you everybody. Okay. My name is Asti Widyasti. You can call me Asti. And today I will present about adolescence and health. Particularly is about reproductive health. And in the beginning, we thought that it might not have a relationship with the subject that you're studying at the moment. But believe me, HIV and also sexual reproductive health is actually development issues. So it's everybody business, not just health issues. For those who will be working in IT, we know that at the moment, I can give you example that sex workers in many cities in Indonesia are actually using mobile phones to meet their clients. Yeah? And when you're working at international development, you will do advocacy, which is also part of this subject. So I just want to let you know that although you might not see the link right now, but believe me, all things that you've been studying for and will be still studying later on can contribute hugely to these issues. Well, in Indonesia, why HIV and sexual reproductive health is still become a problem? Because many people think this is only health problem. And later on I can show you that this is a problem of like intersectional issues, including education, including the topic or the subjects that you are now studying. Yeah? Okay. And please stop me anytime. This is supposed to be like interactive discussion. Don't be afraid to say something that come up on your mind. There is no stupid question, not at all. And this is not supposed to be like concert giant. I will not like singing and make you suffer for like 30 minutes. So please, wherever you want to ask question, just stop me. Raise your hand and ask the question. Okay. It's on. Okay. So, who is adolescent? In terms of age, what do you think adolescence? What like period in terms of age adolescent is? 18? Yes, that include. Apa lagi? From 18 to or from under 18 to any idea? Yang di belakang punya ide? Kalau kita ngomong remaja or adolescent, umurnya, batasan umurnya berapa aja kira-kira? 18? Is it only 18 or starting from 18? 11 to 18? Good. Yeah. Teman-teman, we do have a problems with definition. So if you confuse what is adolescent, what is young people, it's okay. That's the confusion is valid because we have a lot of definition of adolescence. Okay, so I just want to bring you to next slide, please. Yeah, based on UN United Nations definition, the youth or pemuda in bahasa Indonesia is those who are aged 15 to 24, and adolescents, like our colleagues here say, it's on the age of 10 to 19. But in fact, in our law, Indonesian law, atau Undang-Undang Kepemudaan Indonesia, the term of pemuda is those who are age of 16 to 30. So yang di sini masih termasuk apa? By this definition, pemuda, ya. Kawan-kawan semua masih muda-muda dan imut. Ya, apalagi dibandingkan dengan saya tentu saja. Oke, next slide please. Nah, what is so special with adolescents? Dan kawan-kawan yang ada di sini pasti pernah melalui masa adolescence, masa remaja. You may have also like adolescent sister, younger brothers. For those who are adult, you must have experience dealing with adolescents. And this is the time where people always complaining. They are susah diatur, they are bandel, they are nakal, they don't want to listen. And a lot of like stigmatized or problematic words than dealing with adolescent. While in fact, we just learned from neuroscience that in the adolescent period, the brain is still developing. Yeah, so the brain for adolescents, in comparison with adult, is very different. The adult, the brain function is already completed, is already developed and completed. But in adolescent period, and thank you for neuroscience that we learned about this. When I went to medical school, we don't have this knowledge yet. But now we learn in adolescence, the part of the brain which is we call prefrontal cortex. Don't be intimidated with this strange word. Just forget it. But I just want to say to you that one part of the brain which is try to bagian otak yang, let me explain it in bahasa because it will be easier for us together. So bagian otak di remaja yang mengerjakan pengambilan keputusan itu masih berkembang. Tapi bagian otak yang impulsif, yang kemudian menerima reward kalau dia having fun dan mengambil perilaku-perilaku beresiko itu sudah matang. Tapi bagian otak yang mengerem, memikirkan jauh ke depan, akibat, memikirkan dampak-dampak negatif itu belum berkembang. Itulah kenapa di satu sisi remaja bisa sangat impulsif dan dia sangat senang melakukan hal-hal yang menyenangkan, bahkan yang menyerempet resiko, karena otaknya langsung kasih reward buat dia ketika dia melakukan itu. On the other hand, bagian otak yang mengatur kamu harus hati-hati karena nanti ini membahayakanmu, ingat ibumu, ingat bapakmu, ingat masa depanmu, bagian itu belum berkembang. Jadi ibarat kita punya mobil, kita punya gas, tapi kita belum punya rem, atau remnya belum berfungsi dengan baik. That's adolescent brain. Ya, jadi memang perhatian dan cara menangani yang khusus untuk adolescent is very very important. Dan kita nggak bisa klaim kamu nakal, dia bandel, ya karena itu not necessarily themselves, it's their brain yang bikin mereka begitu. Ya, and thanks again to neuroscience that we learn this. Ya, next please. Nah, okay, I want to ask you a question. Anyone knows or anyone can help me explain what is the difference between gender and sex? Apa perbedaan gender dan seks? Ada yang bisa coba jelaskan dan nggak usah takut salah? Yes. Namanya siapa, Dek? Ya, silakan.
Menurut saya kalau gender itu artinya lawan jenis. Kalau seks itu hubungan seksual antara pria dan wanita.
Thank you, Ada lagi? Mungkin yang dari sisi sebelah sini. Terima kasih buat sisi kanan. Yang sisi sebelah sini ada yang mau nambahkan atau mungkin berbeda? Pendapat sangat dihargai seperti pendapat kalian tadi. Ada yang dari sini? Oke, di belakang. Ya.
Menurut saya gender itu sosial konstruk, kalau seks itu biologi.
Oke. Namanya siapa, Dek? Gabriel. Thank you, Lam and Gabriel. Kita bisa kasih applause ya karena teman-teman kita sudah berusaha menjawab pertanyaan saya dan membantu saya tidak konser giant, tidak ngomong sendiri di sini. Jadi yang dibilang Lam adalah yang kebanyakan orang pikir, ya. People think that sex is only sexual intercourse, but actually is broader than that. And Gabriel pointing out that kalau kita ngomong seks, seks itu berarti jenis kelamin saja, segala sesuatu yang sifatnya biologis. Ya, perempuan punya payudara yang bisa berkembang, perempuan punya rahim, perempuan punya vagina, laki-laki punya penis, laki-laki punya testis, laki-laki punya jakun. Nah, itu yang seks ya, karakteristik biologis. Sementara kalau gender is something that socially constructed, which is yang merepresentasikan atau menghubungkan menjadi laki-laki dan perempuan di masyarakat. So it's almost like jenis kelamin sosial. Kalau tadi seks itu biologis, kalau gender itu sosial. Ya, jadi sebenarnya sesuatu yang dibentuk dari masa ke masa dan orang kemudian membuat kalau laki-laki dia berarti harus maskulin, six pack, harus jadi kepala rumah tangga, harus nggak nangis. Sementara kalau perempuan dia harusnya lemah lembut, rambut panjang, lurus, cantik. So that's gender, not sex, ya. Nah, in adolescent period ini menjadi problematik karena perkembangan bentukan gender tadi, traditional role is developed. Jadi perempuan dan laki-laki remaja is both at the same what should I call it? It's like they impact by the traditional gender role on how becoming man and on how becoming women. For example, perempuan-perempuan, anak remaja perempuan, karena memang dia dikondisikan untuk jadi nurturing role, menjadi ibu, mendampingi suami, so ada banyak tekanan untuk menikah di masa muda, ya, untuk mendorong pemenuhan role gender tradisional bahwa perempuan harus jadi ibu, ya. So nggak usah sekolah tinggi-tinggi karena nantinya akan jadi balik-balik lagi di dapur jadi ibu. So this is like what Oscar say, socially constructed, ya. Jadi yang membuat ini menjadi sangat merugikan traditional gender roles karena buat perempuan, karena dia dianggap dia harus lemah lembut, merawat keluarga, membesarkan anak, dia ditekan untuk cepat menikah, kemungkinan drop out. Saya tanya ke teman-teman, kalau ada satu keluarga, uangnya tidak cukup banyak, anaknya ada laki-laki dan perempuan, dan mereka harus memilih satu aja yang bisa lanjut. Kira-kira mana yang akan di drop out, dikorbankan dalam tanda kutip? Perempuan, ya? Exactly. Itu berbasis, decision making is based on traditional gender roles. Makanya perempuan lebih rentan untuk school drop out. Dan semua ini ketika berhubungan dengan kemiskinan membuat perempuan lebih mungkin untuk dipaksa melakukan unprotected sex, both of their peers atau lewat ketika dia selling sex karena dia sangat miskin, dia perlu uang untuk keluarganya dan dia selling sex. So hasilnya adalah kehamilan yang sangat awal, and we know that adolescent pregnancy, the risk of dying is twice as high from the adult pregnancy. Jadi problematik ya dalam kondisi ini, dan perempuan remaja juga menjadi rentan terhadap gender-based violence. Apakah laki-laki kemudian bebas dari resiko-resiko karena pembagian peran gender tradisional yang juga dibentuk di masa remaja? Tidak. Laki-laki juga karena dia harus didorong, they portray good adolescent boys as orang-orang yang gaul, yang berani terima tantangan, yang kalau beberapa waktu lalu kita lihat anak-anak muda suka nyetir dengan kecepatan tinggi dan direkam di Instagram, upload di Instagram, so this kind of thing, berusaha menunjukkan maskulinitas, menjadi laki-laki. Dan laki-laki remaja pun ditekan untuk menunjukkan dirinya ke masyarakat bahwa dia maskulin. Lewat apa? Akhirnya yang terjadi lewat ini. Bergabung dengan geng, or in armed conflict areas, they might be one of the like militia, untuk perang antar geng dan antar grup, atau mencoba drugs, drinking alkohol. Tidak semuanya karena keinginan sendiri. Most of the time it's linked with the social expectation on being adolescent boys. Yang keren adalah mereka yang try drugs. Yang keren adalah mereka yang using drugs and alcohol. Jadi remaja pun akhirnya laki-laki terdorong untuk melakukan ini, and by the time they're doing this, they become prone to unprotected sex as well. Yeah, prone to accident, prone to death, and also prone to unprotected sex. So the traditional gender role is problematic both for girls and also for boys. Yeah, next please. Now, so far, following the discussion, any ideas why then we need to invest on adolescents? Ada yang bisa berbagi? Ada yang bisa kasih ide? Anyone? Kira-kira kenapa ya kita kemudian perlu invest di adolescent? Ya, investasinya apa? Macam-macam. We can do the investment on education, we can do it on social protection, we can do it on health. Silakan Kak.
Jadi menurut saya kenapa kita harus investasi seperti kayak investasi pendidikan moral ke anak-anak remaja, karena anak-anak remaja sendiri itu mereka masih dalam fase transisi dari menuju anak-anak menuju ke masa dewasa. Jadi mental mereka itu tuh masih sangat labil, mereka mudah sekali diperdaya oleh orang-orang yang tidak bertanggung jawab atau orang yang lebih dewasa dibanding mereka. Jadi dalam masa-masa remaja ini mereka harus sering diinvestasikan dalam pendidikan dan moral agar mereka itu tidak jatuh ke dalam pergaulan yang salah. Karena masa remaja itu kan cuma sekali, jadi setidaknya kita bisa membantu mereka itu mengisi masa remaja mereka dengan hal-hal yang lebih bermanfaat. Itu aja.
Felicia, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Your points is very, very good that if we invest in education on adolescents, then we have something much more in return. Yeah. I will talk about it a little bit more in the next slide. So, next slide please. Ya, teman-teman kalau nanti buka jurnal, ada jurnal yang sangat terkenal di bidang kesehatan namanya The Lancet. The Lancet itu punya series of article which is argue and also membuktikan, nggak cuma argue tapi dia juga membuktikan dengan data that coordinated investment in adolescent health, well-being and education provide high economic and social return. Seperti yang saya bilang tadi ya. And why? Kenapa adolescent itu bisa menjadi sangat berharga kalau kita invest? Karena kita akan dapat hasilnya di saat ini, di masa adolescent itu juga. Lalu saat mereka dewasa, dan ternyata ini yang penting, the investment on adolescent tidak hanya menguntungkan ketika mereka dewasa, saat ini dan mereka dewasa, tapi dampaknya, dan ini ada hitung-hitungannya, teman-teman bisa cek lebih lanjut di The Lancet yang ngomongin adolescent, dia ada seri tentang remaja. The impact of investing on adolescent will reach the next generation. So can you imagine, kita nggak hanya mempengaruhi remaja sekarang dan ketika mereka dewasa nanti, tapi kita akan mempengaruhi satu generasi berikutnya. So that's why it's really hitung-hitungan sangat menguntungkan untuk investasi di adolescent. Next slide please. Nah, kita tahu bahwa di dunia ini sebenarnya jumlah proporsi jadinya artinya perbandingan. Proportion of adolescent with all the population is declining. Tapi jumlahnya sebenarnya tetap banyak. Dan ada yang namanya demographic dividend, adalah saat sebuah negara bisa mengambil keuntungan sebanyak-banyaknya ketika jumlah remajanya banyak dan dia investasi dengan baik di sana dengan makro serta mikroekonomi. Nah, dengan demikian kalau dia invest dengan makro dan mikroekonomi pada adolescent, artinya pendidikan akan bagus, kualitas kesehatan akan bagus, social protection bagaimana mereka melindungi diri sendiri juga bagus, angka beban-beban penyakit berkurang, uang yang dikumpulkan lebih banyak, jadi sebuah negara akan mendapatkan keuntungan dari jumlah remaja yang banyak itu tadi. Tapi hanya jika pemerintahnya kemudian memang melakukan sesuatu yang serius untuk remaja-remaja ini di masa ini. Ya, next slide please. Nah, lalu kenapa kita sekarang ngomongin poverty? Ya? Dan di Indonesia, kalau teman-teman tertarik, I can share. I haven't got the chance to extract the Indonesian region, but I have it, and I will be happy to share with you about Indonesian data. But poverty, kalau kita ngomongin adolescent, dan ini kenapa teman-teman bidang yang berbeda-beda pun selain health itu akan kontribusi untuk masa depan masyarakat, termasuk remaja, pemuda, anak-anak, dan sebuah negara menjadi lebih besar, ya, yang lebih cerah maksud saya. Nah, kita perlu investasi di remaja karena kalau kita break siklus kemiskinan, itu kita bisa mengatasi banyak sekali masalah. Ya, contohnya, next please. Ya, kita lihat kasus remaja perempuan. Kita mungkin dengar di luar sana dan mungkin kita merasa ini this is far beyond me. This is not me, this is not my friend, this is those who are at risk, this is those who are sex worker, the client, this is those who are injecting drug user, this is those who are doing the unprotected sex, so they got HIV and they got unintended pregnancy, kehamilan yang tidak diinginkan. And they suffer from perdarahan because they trying to stop the pregnancy. Maybe you thought this group is far away from you, but in fact, kalau kita mau lihat kasus-kasus kehamilan remaja yang tidak direncanakan itu sangat banyak, ada banyak di antara kita. Dan orang yang hidup dengan HIV bisa saja ada di antara kita karena dia tidak bergejala sampai beberapa tahun, ya. So, cuman mau bilang bahwa selagi di Indonesia epideminya masih ada di concentrated in key population like sex workers, injecting drug user, men who have sex with men, but this is everybody problem karena penyakit infeksi virus ini juga ditransmisikan lewat hubungan seksual, ya. Dan kalau kita lihat, kalau kita telusuri, if we want to break down the root causes of HIV infection and also unintended pregnancy atau kehamilan yang tidak diinginkan, sebenarnya sama. Akar-akar masalahnya sebenarnya balik ke kemiskinan. So poverty is the root cause. Next please, itu kenapa kita penting ngomongin kemiskinan. Dan kemiskinan bisa diatasi dari banyak cara, banyak subjek, banyak topik, termasuk hal-hal yang teman-teman sedang pelajari sekarang. Jadi saya sangat bersemangat ngomong sekarang karena saya yakin kawan-kawan sedang dengan belajar di areanya teman-teman ini, teman-teman sedang making change untuk Indonesia di masa depan. Ya, so keep doing it dan teman-teman sebenarnya bisa langsung kontribusi ke sini tanpa teman-teman sadari, ya. Tapi sekarang jadi sadar hubungannya. Nah, kenapa kemudian kita perlu mengatasi masalah kemiskinan, terutama di remaja? Karena ternyata ada perbedaan health outcome between being poor dan menjadi remaja yang kaya. Remaja miskin dan remaja kaya. Remaja miskin lebih dari 3 kali lebih mungkin untuk melahirkan dibandingkan remaja yang kaya. Kenapa ya? Ada yang tahu sebabnya? Kenapa? By statistik, by hitung-hitungan statistik, the poor adolescent will 3 times more likely to give birth dibandingkan dengan remaja yang kaya. Ada yang bisa kasih reasoning kira-kira kenapa? Ada 2 orang, yang satu remaja miskin, yang satu remaja kaya. Kemungkinan remaja miskin ini untuk hamil sebelum nikah, sebelum waktunya, masih di bawah umur, itu 3 kali lebih tinggi, 3 kali lebih mungkin dibandingkan remaja kaya. Ada yang bisa mengira-ngira logiknya bagaimana? Anyone? Oke. Karena remaja yang kaya lebih banyak punya modal pengetahuan yang dibilang Felicia tadi. Dia lebih banyak punya modal pengetahuan untuk mencegah kehamilan yang tidak diinginkan. Ya, kalau dia more likely untuk menunda seksual debutnya atau hubungan seks pertama kali. Secondly, kalau dia mau berhubungan seks, dia akan pakai kontrasepsi untuk melindungi dirinya, atau dia bisa menolak. They will have like self-resilience untuk against peer pressure, sehingga ketika dipaksa berhubungan seks dia bisa menolak. Ya. Dia bisa punya suara dengan relasinya untuk tidak berhubungan seks dulu, atau kalau dia memutuskan berhubungan seks, dia tahu untuk menggunakan kontrasepsi. Dia bisa minta tolong tenaga kesehatan atau dia bisa beli alat kontrasepsi. Dia bisa beli kondom misalnya. Tapi ini bukan kondisinya bagi perempuan atau remaja miskin. Ya, dia nggak tahu, dia nggak punya pengetahuannya, dia nggak punya dukungan, dia nggak punya akses. Contoh dukungan adalah yang kawan-kawan punya di kampus ini tadi, meskipun dalam konteks yang berbeda. When I heard about the Buddies program, it's the support that you can have, and poor adolescent don't have this kind of support. Ya, kan Buddies itu kayak some kind of psychosocial support juga kan, ketika kita masih malu datang ke kampus atau masih ini kayaknya aneh banget gedungnya, saya belum terlalu ngerti dari mana mau kemana, saya nggak tahu mau makan di mana, dan ada support, ada orang lain yang membantu kita getting around. Ya, support seperti ini yang poor adolescents punya, ya, dalam konteks yang lebih luas. So ini contoh aja biar teman-teman lebih gampang membayangkannya. Lanjut. Ya, jadi sudah jelas remaja miskin, kondisi kesehatannya makin parah, ya, karena apa? Kemungkinan dia ke sekolahnya tidak bisa full, dia sakit-sakitan, or even dia bisa drop out. They can drop out from school, they can die in the middle of umur remaja, ya, because of AIDS. Kita punya kasus AIDS di remaja di Indonesia makin berkembang, dan yang mulai meninggal karena belum dapat pertolongan juga sudah cukup banyak. Kalaupun mereka tetap hidup, ya, karena dan tidak sakit sampai parah sampai meninggal, they put heavily financial burden or social burden. Lanjut. Dan juga tadi saya sudah sempat bilang di awal, poor adolescents itu lebih mudah terpapar dengan sexual reproductive health issues, termasuk exploitation, termasuk they can exchange sex with men. Ya, lanjut saja. Jadi ini sangat beda efeknya ke remaja kaya dan remaja miskin. Ini mirip seperti tadi, kita lewatin saja. Next please. Oke, ini kondisi di Indonesia kawan-kawan. We can see here that, sorry kalau slide tidak terlalu jelas, the left side is better than this. So you can see this one. The adolescent fertility rate in Indonesia, based on Indonesia Demographic and Health Survey, it's declining, but the other surveys surpass showing that the rate is higher. Apa artinya? Remaja yang hamil itu jumlahnya masih banyak dan terus meningkat. Jakarta dan Jogja, salah dua provinsinya, lalu 500,000 births are among remaja. Jadi kebayang ya, 500-an ribu kehamilan itu terjadi di kawan-kawan yang umurnya mungkin seperti teman-teman atau bahkan jauh lebih muda. Artinya mereka nggak bisa lanjut sekolah, mereka akan punya resiko kehamilan lebih tinggi, dan anaknya juga akan terdampak. Ya. 1 in 9 girls married before the age of 18, itu kasus di Indonesia juga kawan-kawan. Ini semua, ya, kalau yang ini, kalau tadi global, ini Indonesia. Kita punya banyak sekali PR untuk ini. Dan bagaimana mempromosikan mereka tahu haknya, mereka bisa tetap sekolah, ada banyak cara. Dan sekali lagi, sekolahnya teman-teman dengan fakultas dan topik subjek major yang beda-beda, bisa semua kontribut di sini. Ya. Bahkan nanti kalau ada pertanyaan, saya sekolah di sini, bagaimana Mbak Asti berpikir ini bisa kontribut? Saya pasti punya jawabannya. So happy to discuss more. dan teman-teman bisa semua kontribut ke permasalahan ini. Lalu udah fertility rate-nya tinggi, contraceptive use-nya sangat rendah, sayang sekali ya. Di samping itu, new HIV infection increasing terus, especially among adolescent girls. Yeah, so this is another problem for us. And then because of the law, jadi kita juga punya tantangan lain di Indonesia. We know we have this problem, angka kematian ibu tinggi, angka kehamilan remaja tinggi, tapi akses ke kontrasepsi perempuan belum punya. Dia boleh akses kalau dia sudah menikah. And we know banyak remaja belum menikah, ya. Dan dia biasanya harus dapat persetujuan suami. So she cannot access it by her own. She need approval from her husband to get the contraception. And the law said, when you are not married yet, the health providers couldn't give you the contraception. So can you imagine, in one hand, they are makhluk seksual yang berkembang, yang mulai mengalami dorongan seksual, sebagian bisa abstinen, sebagian tidak, tapi sebagian yang tidak bisa abstinen itu kemudian tidak bisa dapat kontrasepsi untuk melindungi diri. So this is our current portrait of Indonesia, terutama untuk menjadi remaja. Next slide please. Jadi teman-teman, ini sedikit data yang kalau teman-teman pengen lihat lebih lanjut, maybe ideas buat bikin assignment. Kalau mau bikin yang konteks Indonesia bisa lihat dari data ini. Saya bisa tinggalkan slide-nya, tapi saya nggak akan bahas lebih panjang. Tapi poinnya adalah ada gap, there is gap, huge gap between wealthy adolescent, poor adolescent, between boys and girls, and between those who live in rural areas versus urban areas. And we don't even have like universal health coverage karena masih sekitar ada 7%, next please, and more, hampir 8% adolescent nggak punya KTP dan nggak punya angka yang lebih besar tidak punya BPJS, ya. Sekitar 36% remaja Indonesia dan pemuda Indonesia don't have BPJS. So kita hanya bisa membayangkan kalau mereka jatuh sakit dan butuh perawatan dan mereka tidak di-cover asuransi. Ya. Kemiskinan makin parah, ya, baik di anak ini, remaja ini maupun keluarga. Jadi, kenapa ini penting buat kita semua, and what this is also matter to you guys sebagai pemimpin mahasiswa dan sebagai calon pemimpin masa depan? Ya karena kita punya, we have a shared responsibility kan buat terutama teman-teman yang punya privilege untuk going to university. Jadi kita punya sebenarnya tanggung jawab moral untuk mereka yang not lucky enough to study in good university like Binus, or not to even go to the university, ya. Jadi kita punya tanggung jawab moral untuk bantu mereka juga. Next please.
Ibu maaf.
Oke, I'll be finishing soon. Lalu sebagai untuk government penting, ya karena government kan tujuannya serving masyarakat, termasuk young people, termasuk adolescent. Dan di sini, next please, di sini kemudian, masih companies belum, tapi the companies, skills and education yang dibutuhkan oleh adolescent and youth itu major precursor buat investment economic growth, itu sudah jelas ya. Sekali lagi kenapa penting buat kita. Dan berikutnya, yang ini berhubungan dengan visi BINUS yang tadi Direktur bilang di awal. Adolescent are powerful change agent, often highly active members of civil society. Jadi kalau teman-teman mau serving community, teman-teman serving youth, itu efeknya sudah berlipat ganda karena teman-teman pasti serving the community not just now, but also community for the next generation. Seperti yang saya sudah jelaskan sebelumnya tadi. Next slide please. Di teknologi juga, ini both ways, youth and teknologi. Bukan saja teknologi melayani youth, tapi youth itu driving teknologi berkembang. Ya, itu sangat jelas. Nah, ini yang terakhir sekali, apa hubungannya secangkir kopi, harga secangkir kopi dengan investasi di youth? Ada yang tahu? Kira-kira kalau kopi tanpa menyebut merek, kopi-kopi yang di kafe berapaan sih harganya kawan-kawan? 50 ribuan kan? Ada yang lebih murah dan ada yang lebih mahal, mungkin bervariasi. Ya, saya melihat teman-teman setuju. Ini yang kopi yang agak-agak mahalan ya. Oke, kita akan lihat kaitannya dengan investasi pada remaja di slide berikut. And this is my almost last slide. Cuman mau bilang harga sekitar $4,60 atau $3,80, harga rata-rata secangkir kopi. Jumlah itu yang sebenarnya kita butuhkan kalau kita mau investasi ke remaja. Jadi ini studi dari Lancet. Again, teman-teman bisa Google kalau mau lihat artikel atau jurnal lengkapnya. Tapi di situ dia menemukan hitung-hitungan bahwa memperbaiki kesehatan mental, seksual dan fisikal remaja dengan cost sekitar $5 per orang per tahun, itu kita bisa membuat 10 kali lipat keuntungan ekonomi dengan cara membalikkan atau mencegah 12 juta kematian adolescents. Ya, you can also read the rest tentang child marriage. Kita bisa kemudian investasi untuk mengurangi, karena child marriage problem yang besar di negara Asia Pasifik termasuk kita Indonesia dan negara tetangga-tetangga kita. Tapi dengan harga yang tidak sampai secangkir kopi ya per orang per tahun, kita bisa membuat perbedaan. Jadi teman-teman bisa bayangkan kalau pemerintah beserta sektor swasta dan semua masyarakat itu kontribut ke sini, kita pasti bisa punya masyarakat yang jauh lebih tangguh, keren, dan berkembang di masa depan. That's all for me, teman-teman. Waktunya udah habis. Terima kasih banyak untuk kontribusinya.
Many thanks, Ibu Dr. Asti. Alright, so again, without further ado, I would like to introduce our second speaker. So I would like to read her beautiful CV. So Miss Levana Sani completed a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry and having a minor in entrepreneurship from the University of Southern California. And she then continued to take a master's in business administration from Harvard Business School. So for work experience, I can see here Ms. Levana Sani have had a lot of experience in Jakarta, Los Angeles, and Singapore. So right at the moment, she actually established a company called Nala Genetics. Yeah, so she's a co-founder and the managing director of that company. So this company provides personalized dose and prescriptions for Asians. So I think without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Levana Sani to introduce about probably Nala Genetics and present her.
I'm going to be doing this presentation all in English, because if I have to do it in Indonesian, it would, I don't know a lot of the technical terms. But the reason I think I was asked to speak here is because, again, like you said, they think it's important, or university thinks it's very important for you to think globally. What is going on in the world? What's your contribution to something that matters? Not only here, not only to the surrounding community that you can see, but what's happening, sort of the trend in the world. And so for me, one of the most profound moments in my career and in my schooling was sort of the discovery of the DNA. I was a very nerdy kid growing up. So I read this book, it's called, this book by Siddhartha Mukherjee. It was about the gene essentially, and it was telling us the story of how the DNA was invented, or found, sorry, not invented, it was found, and why it's so important today that we know about this. So he said, there's three things essentially that is very important in the 21st century. Number one is the atom, the second is the byte, the third is the gene. It is really the building blocks of everything we know in life. And so since at the time I wasn't a physicist or a chemist, I didn't code, and so I was like, oh, biology could be my thing, and gene could be something that I believe I could be really good at. So I really enjoyed this book. But I was born in 1992, but in 1994, long before I knew anything about the DNA, a lot of people were already very interested about this notion of what is the building block of life tell you about who you are. It said that infidelity or whether or not you're going to cheat with your partner is actually caused by the DNA. Or how smart you are is the DNA. Or whether or not you believe in God is the DNA. Obviously, it's a long time ago. It's 15 years ago. We've learned a lot, right? But we started out by being so curious about who we are internally and what made us. And I think that that very strong connection about what you are and who you are inside really resonated with me as I was growing up. And then as we know more and more about the genetic makeup of humans and also many, many animals and other living things, we started to sort of realize that actually not everything is DNA, not everything is your human, is purely things that are given by God. They understand that maybe science could change things, that humans can take decisions that matter more than the DNA makeup that actually constitute their life. And finally, someone actually did that, who's Angelina Jolie, apparently, who's the poster child now for taking action knowing, based on knowing their genetic risk. So the story with Angelina Jolie is that in 2013, she knew that she had a mutation for a BRCA gene, which makes her very prone to breast cancer. She didn't have breast cancer, but her mom died of breast cancer, and another family member also died from breast cancer. She decided to take to undergo an operation and to reduce her risk that way. So she's controlling her fate almost, more than the DNA of what makes her. So why I think it's also interesting is not only are we so curious, this curiosity is also then influencing sort of what technical improvements or technological improvements that we see in the field. The cost of genetic sequencing started out as $1 billion, one person, but now it's less than $100 almost. And so the drastic drop, I think, of genetic sequencing make everyone think that like something that is so expensive now anyone could do. And so that the commoditization of knowing what it means, knowing what DNA means to you means a lot. Now anyone can be interested and should be interested. And in 2015, when I was a year after graduating college, this president of the United States decided that he was going to declare war on cancer and that personalized medicine is going to be the way that we're going to do it. And it was a huge deal because not a lot of presidents were keen on talking about science, and so it created a global spark. This was the year that IBM Watson started taking off, and there's a lot of like AI and machine learning and the data that we get from genetics and how do we analyze it. And so the fact that he endorsed this globally sparked a lot of interest. And at that same time as well is when I was in Genomics Institute of Singapore and working as a research officer. This is actually a picture of me and my co-founding team in AlloGenetics. So the story after I read, after I was really interested about the DNA after I graduated college, I really wanted to learn more and see what really is the DNA, like what are people doing about it, and what are people actually what projects are people actually working on in Asia. And so the closest thing that we have is, that I thought I had at the time was working in Singapore at this place called Biopolis. These three are my bosses. They gave me projects that I absolutely have no actual skill to do, but they gave me responsibility to take on projects, and I'm very grateful for that. One of the projects that really caught my eye was the way that we could tell by your DNA which drugs you can and cannot take. At that time, my grandfather was sick, so he was taking more than like 8 or 10 drugs at once, and he was taking a lot of dosage that was not right for him. And finally, because he was having a lot of really weird reactions, we took him to the US, and then the doctor in the US, who was a white guy, told us, this man is an Asian man, he couldn't take this much dose for this drug. It's a very common thing that happens in Asian people. And I was like, that is so ironic that someone from the US would tell my grandpa, and we went to like 10 doctors in Indo and Singapore to figure out what was wrong with him. And it was so ironic that we had to go 1,000 miles away to finally realize what was wrong with him. So I realized that together at my knowledge in University of Singapore, and then that personal story, and also Astrid, my co-founder, also has a personal story about how medications, the wrong medications, can really harm you. Really, actually, if you don't know what medications you should be taking, or it doesn't matter how cool that medicine is or how cool that treatment is. The most important is knowing how to use it in the local population, the local setting. And so Nala Genetics was really built to make that vision real, to make sure that personalized medicine is not a thing of the West. It's not a thing that only the US or the UK can do. It should be done for everyone because it matters. So in some cases, it's life and death. One of the cases of life and death that we explored as Nala Genetics is, so before even going to the case study, I'm sure you've heard of this company called 23andMe. Does anybody know? No, nobody knows 23andMe. Never mind. It's basically a genetic testing service that tells you your ancestry. It will tell you like how many % of you is like from, I don't know, from Philippines or Thailand or Vietnam, you know. So it's pretty cool. It started out selling tests directly to consumers, gitu kan. Tapi the problem is that 23andMe is focused in the US population. So a lot of the findings that we found today in genetics, all of them is based on Caucasian population. It's the white male, essentially, that is, you know, the baseline of genetic information, the genetic discoveries. So they don't know a lot about people like us or people outside of their ethnicities, to be completely honest. And so a lot of companies started out emerging because they realized that, hey, actually, it's also important for you to not only just give something for fun, which is ancestry, but to make sure that it matters to the population that you're addressing, and at the same time give you clinical relevance to do something about it, because genetics in most cases can be life-saving. So these are all the companies that started emerging. Obviously, Nala Genetics claims to be the best in clinical relevance and localization, because I'm very biased. But then the idea is that, you know, the problem with clinical relevance and localization, I don't think this clicker is working anymore. So the clinical relevance is that we realized that 8% of hospital admissions, so jadi kalau misalnya masuk rumah sakit, 8% dari orang yang masuk rumah sakit itu gara-gara salah minum obat atau obatnya itu give you adverse reaction. So what an adverse reaction mean is that obat yang harusnya save your life malah nyebabin masalah yang lain lagi, yang lebih permanen. For example, it's like burning, rash all over your body, you're vomiting until you couldn't work or something like that. 8% of hospital admissions are caused by that. Only 50% prescription have positive outcome. So you know when you go to the doctor and the doctor said, come back in 2 months and we'll see if the drug is working for you or not. That's the status quo right now. It shouldn't be that way. Doctors should know, should have a better idea. It shouldn't be like a flip of a coin. And we think genetics can help. 30% of adverse reactions have genomic associations. So that means that the good thing in knowing that there's a clinical problem is that there's a potential solution. So we can genetically test these people and potentially reduce the rate of adverse reaction by 30%. The important thing about localization is why sebenarnya genetic testing udah ada banyak di dunia. Tapi the problem why it hasn't really come here is because we think it's too expensive. Second one is that, again, the biomarkers or the things that you are measuring is based on like Caucasian population, so it's very hard to internalize or be relevant for us. And then the third one is that physicians sometimes lack supporting trained follow-up. Kalau misalnya lo tanya your medical student like friends, if they're an expert or they took classes in genetics, they would say, yeah, I mean, like 1-2 lectures, that's it. So if they give, like, ada yang galang-galang di belakang juga. And so like they don't know, like if they give the genetic testing report, they'll be like, oh my gosh, sekarang ini ada liability, tambah informasi yang gue harus kasih ke pasien gue, tapi gue nggak tahu gimana caranya gitu. So it becomes a liability more than a benefit. And the problem is that if you don't have the right support and the right follow-up action, it could be very dangerous for the physicians and the patients. So the first project that we actually took to show that two values, relevance and clinical relevance and localization, is actually it's actually this person that we worked with in Papua. So our first project is related to leprosy. The story with leprosy is quite ironic in a way that leprosy doesn't really kill. So kusta itu gara-gara sedihnya copot-copot gitu ya. Tapi when you have a mutation and then you drink the wrong drug, it might actually cause death. And that happens a lot in Papua. It happens about hundreds to 1,000 people in just a few villages in Papua. So what we decided to do was we wanted to create a genetic test that is very cheap so people know which drugs to take. So if you have a certain mutation, you will not be taking that drug, and so you're safe from that adverse reaction. And can take the other 2 antibiotics. But if you're safe, you can take all 3 antibiotics. Very simple idea. So we thought that the actual reaction is actually very cheap. It's about 30,000 rupiah. So again, genetic testing is not something that is a thing of luxury. It should be for everyone because it can be life-saving. That's our collaborators in Papua, and that's the paper that we published a long time ago. So the idea is that currently the status quo, like I said, I think is that patients have to go through like adverse reaction atau enggak trial and error, kayak ngulang-ngulang terus sampai akhirnya ketemu obat yang benar. For now, for reactive pharmacogenomics, so pharmacogenomics is essentially the branch of genetics that tell you which medications you can and cannot take. But essentially, if you have this certain mutation and you're positive, you don't drink this drug called Dapsone. Right, so and then you get better and very safer, and you don't have that adverse reaction, and you don't die, which is great. Now the problem with that is that sometimes in acute conditions, and this is where I'm going to introduce my second speaker as well in genetics, which is a software engineer. The problem with that reactive testing is that sometimes kalau misalnya lu udah sakit nih, udah bleeding, terus masih dokternya mesti harus order tes lagi, terus habis itu nunggu lagi 5 hari, ya orangnya udah meninggal dulu karena bleeding gitu kan. Jadi itu nggak bagus gitu, cara align to the current standard of flow or care flow is not good. So that the problem is, number one, with that type of model is that the turnaround time is not suitable for acute conditions. The second one is that sometimes dokter misalnya lagi sakit epilepsi gitu ya, oh ini harus dites nih, tapi tesnya ada panelnya untuk obatnya, untuk statin gitu atau blood thinner gitu misalnya, atau buat kolesterol, terus orangnya marah, ngapain saya dites yang lain-lain, orang saya sakitnya epilepsi gitu kan. Jadi the long-term benefits of testing really matters in what stage the patient is at. If the patient is thinking about their long-term health, it makes sense for them to be tested for many drugs. But then if the person is thinking only for what they're sick about at that time, then that would obviously think about like what is the cheapest way to get there, which is the only drug that they need to take at the time. And then the third one is really, I might skip this part, but essentially this is because it's really hard to give the right information at the right time. People just basically like ignore it. Okay, we know that this is important to be genetically tested, tapi the doctors are like, capek lah, udahlah, I'll just try it, it's okay, let's just see what happens. And so that probability, they keep taking risk about genetic testing, and the important thing is that, and this is a little bit technical as well, but essentially in genetics, what we do is that we develop genetic testing kits, and we selected the genes that we think is important. Oh my god, what is going on? Okay, the second one is that we created a knowledge base that is essentially clinical decision support for people who already know genetics to be able to take what is the next step of that genetic testing. They would know what to do after they get the genetic information. And then also a mobile and web platform that essentially helps physicians to manage their patients, to make sure that the patients who are taking the drug is actually doing better. And so at this point, all the products that we've built really are at the prototype stage. We're currently going on pilots this year in July in hospitals, and we're always thinking about how to make our products better. And so at this point, I want to introduce you to my software engineer, Sashi, who's involved in building many of the products that we have, and he's going to talk about how we're always thinking about making it better, and the 3 values that we always think about when we're doing that. So.
Hello, my name is Sashi and I work as a software engineer in Nala Genetics. So I am responsible for some of the things that you saw just now, the knowledge base, the patient platform, and the mobile apps that we build. So where we describe about what's Nala Genetics and what we are trying to do, I'm going to be explaining a bit on the motivating factors behind the decisions that we take on how we build our mobile apps and the patient platform and all the other software things that we do. Okay, so there are 3 things. Maybe we should go back. Okay, so there are 3 things that are always at the top of our heads when we are thinking about how to make the apps useful for the patient. The first thing is to make it convenient. Second thing is to make it long-lasting, and the third thing is to make it more interconnected so that the patient actually derives value from it and not just for us as a company. So I'll start with convenience. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when I say convenience? Can I have a word? Yeah. Okay, I'll just continue on. Okay, so a few years ago, like maybe 5 or 10 years ago, if you need to take a taxi, what would you do? You would have to go out to the streets, you should like look for a taxi and be like wave it down, then you should tell the driver, okay, I want to go to this place, how much are you going to charge for that? And like the driver says, oh, you should pay this much, then like you go back and forth, you negotiate a bit on the price, okay, then just hop on. But now if you need to take a taxi, what do? You just like open your app and everything is right there. So even for a foreigner like me, like when I come to Jakarta, it's very easy for me to get a taxi. I don't need to explain to the driver where I want to go or like tell him, oh, go this way, go that way. No, it's just very easy, right? It's just very convenient. So how do we bring this convenience to healthcare and like make it easier for the patients? When it comes to healthcare industry, it's much more complicated than transportation or like food delivery or other things, because it is not just about making it cheaper and like faster for the patient, but sometimes it's also a matter of life and death. So I strongly believe that by digitizing our health records and having it in an electronic format, it's going to be very beneficial for the patients, because you can access it anywhere, anytime, as long as you have like an internet connection. So like imagine if you're going to a different country and you don't speak the local language, it's going to be difficult, and you also have a medical emergency. You may not remember all your health history, you may not like have every single record or like a lab report that you got, but if you have it all in a digital format, you will not have a paper report, but if you have it in a digital format, it is going to be very easy to access it and show it to your doctor and say, oh, see, this is the lab report I got 2 months ago, and so this is the problem I'm facing now. Or like imagine if you are in a place where they don't speak the language, the software could even probably convert it from your language to the doctor's language and make it easier for them to understand. Sometimes the terms that we use for medications or like even for medicines in one country is quite different from what it is in another country. So software can be like a great enabler to help us to convert from like our own country's system of medication to the other country's system of medication. Then lastly, if you have to like book an appointment or something, and then like you have to explain to the doctor what is the condition that you're facing. In Jakarta especially, I heard that there is a service where you can call the doctor and say like, hey, I'm facing this condition, and then like, depending on your problems, maybe the doctor can send someone to your house to take care of you, or like maybe send an ambulance if your situation is very critical. Imagine if like you have your health records and you have shared it with the hospital previously, then they can access like what exactly is your problem and what drugs or like what other treatments are likely to be needed immediately to you, and they could send it along with the ambulance to your house. So that really makes it very effective and useful for the patient. So this is a chatbot. I was thinking of doing a demo, but I'm not sure if I can do it today. Okay. Mary spoke about adverse drug reaction, and one of the key problems that we solve is to reduce the number of adverse drug reactions that a patient has. So at Nala Genetics, we are experimenting with this chatbot, which can interactively talk with the patient and like ask them questions on like which drug are you taking, which condition did you face, like after taking the drug, when did you last take it, these kind of things. And it can automate the process of recording the drug reactions that a patient is facing. And by having everything digitally, it's going to be very easy for the doctor to compare with the patient's existing record and check, oh, so this patient was given this drug before, and like 2 months later they've been prescribed this drug, and now there's a reaction. Is there a link between this drug and the previous drug? Or like, what is the best course of action to move on from here? So this is not ready yet. We are still working on it to make it better before we actually add it to the mobile apps that we have. So the second thing is, how do we make it long-lasting? By digitizing it, we are already making it like making everything available on a computer. And as you know, storage is very cheap these days. When I was younger, we used to like make CDs to show to like store photos, videos, or anything else. But like sometimes the CDs would get scratched and then like all your data is lost. But these days, I'm sure you guys use like Instagram or Facebook to upload all your photos. You probably don't really use CDs or other things. But the advantage is that like 5 years later, if you want to find like pictures of your holiday somewhere, it's very easy, right? You just open your Instagram, scroll down, or like on Facebook, open the album, and everything is right there. So imagine by having your digital health records, you have to like try to look for a drug that you took 10 years ago, which you know it caused a reaction, but you don't remember the name of the drug. It's not like flipping a paper-based thing and like going back 10 years in time, but like everything is easily available for you. You can just search, okay, go to this year, which drug did I take, which hospital did I go to, which doctor did I consult. Everything is available no matter how much time has passed. You don't have to remember anything, you don't have to like flip through things and like search for things. It makes it much more convenient. So that's variable records and permanent storage. But what about like multi-generation medical and genetic records? When we talk about like genetic health, sometimes we may have diseases which are genetic, and we may pass it down to our descendants. Like we previously saw, like was it Angelina Jolie? Yeah. She had her mother had breast cancer, and like she got cured because the chance of her getting breast cancer is also high. So going to be the next slide. Okay. So this is a disease called Wilson's disease. My friend's mom was diagnosed with this a while ago. The disease is actually genetic. It is caused by excessive buildup of copper in the body. You can see that there is a yellow ring around the eyes. That is the copper buildup. It is very easy to prevent this disease if you know that you have a high chance of getting it. You just have to stop eating like food that is rich in copper, like chocolates, mushrooms, nuts, and other things. But it is very difficult to diagnose because the conditions that you will experience is very similar to jaundice. So in my friend's mom's case, the doctors initially thought it was jaundice and they were treating her for it. But after 2 months, they referred her to a doctor in the US, and the doctor said, hey, maybe you should get tested for Wilson's disease. It's common in the US, but not very common in India. And eventually, she did have Wilson's disease, and she passed away, and her kids immediately got tested to make sure that they are not carrying the genes. Sometimes the genetic disease might skip a generation, like your grandparents may have it, your parents may not have it, but you may have it. But by digitizing it, no matter how many generations ago it was, you will still be able to like go back and see. And with technology improving quite fast, and our understanding of the DNA is growing as well. So by having all this on record, if like there is a future discovery, maybe in our grandchildren's time, they will still benefit from the digitization that we are doing right now. So the last thing is interconnected. So like I said, my friend's mom had to consult the doctor in the US, but how do you go about like getting your data from one hospital to another? Usually our data is like stored by the hospital, not really by us. But if we can make this system more interconnected and give the patient the power to choose which doctor they want to consult and which hospital they want to consult, it's going to be a game changer for free. At Nala Genetic, actually, our patient portal has the option to like choose your genetic reports with like more than one doctor. So you can choose like whether you want to share your reports with like this doctor, or do you want to share your entire history with this doctor. And the patient is the one who ultimately decides who he goes to and who he gets treated. I think that's very important. And we also have like clinical decision support, which tells the doctor like, hey, this person has an allergy, maybe you should like increase the dosage or decrease the dosage. It basically aids the doctor based on the records that are already there. And the diagnosis and the findings in one hospital can also aid the doctors in another hospital. So by making the system more interconnected, the patient alone is benefited by this. We also have like genetic counseling at Nala Genetics. We make sure that the patients have access to genetic counselors. But there are only 600 of these genetic counselors in Asia. So if like you live in a place where there are no genetic counselors, would you still be able to give counsel and like know what your genetic report actually says and how you can like best use the report to gain maximum value out of it? So by making the system more interconnected, it makes it very easy to access doctors in other places and even give consultations and other things from them. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of telesurgery, but it's a new field where like doctors in one part of the world can operate on patients in a totally different part of the world as long as they have the surgical instruments. Previously, the slow speed of internet was a blocker for this, but nowadays with increasing mobile connection and internet speeds, this is not a problem at all. So far I've probably spoken about all the good things that I've painted like a rosy picture, but that's not all. There are some challenges which are very serious and we need to think about as well. The first is data privacy. You might have heard of data security breaches and like people like selling somebody's data to other people and all that. And while data is very important and like it needs to be protected, but for it to be of use, it must be shared with other people as well. But the key is in deciding what data to share and what to not share. So like if I conduct a survey here and like ask you guys which ice cream is your favorite, like which flavor of ice cream is your favorite, then I go and I sell it to someone and say that, okay, people in cybersecurity class probably like vanilla flavor. That's fine. I don't think any of you guys would care about it, right? Because it doesn't matter who is actually in the class. But if I say like, oh, this particular student likes this flavor of ice cream, like here, this is phone number, call them, that is a big no, because that is violating your privacy to your own data and your like phone number and things like that. So while we try to make it convenient and interconnected, we should also make sure that the patient is the one who has the full authority on who he wants to share data with. There are many laws regarding this, like HIPAA in the US and like PDPA in Singapore, but these laws generally like just lay the outlines, but they leave it to the companies to actually decide what they want to implement and how they want to do it. So it is up to the engineers and like the business people in the company to like make sure that the patient's interests are always at the top of their head and they design everything accordingly. And then moving on to AI. AI is like a very hot topic these days, and also one of the key applications of AI is in healthcare. But how ready are we to like let software decide what medications we take or like what treatments we undergo? I don't think it would be appropriate to like let a deep learning model suggest that, oh, you should be taking this medication, because we can't explain why the deep learning model actually came up with that. Deep learning and other AI topics are kind of like a black box. There are very few people who actually understand what actually goes on behind it. So at Nala Genetics, what we do is that we make sure that the doctor has all the information needed, all the scientific evidences and the information needed. And so like we say, hey, this patient may not really be suitable to take this drug. And the reason is that there are established studies done before, and here are the papers. You can look for it. You can open it and see it yourself. So the doctor always has access to the complete information behind why a certain suggestion was made by the software. So by doing this, we make sure that the doctor and the patient know completely what's going on, and it's not just the software randomly suggesting something, and the patient just is taking the medicine because, oh, the software said it, we don't know why. And moving on to the last point, security is very important, obviously, because we need to make sure people's data is safe and nobody is stealing it from us, and nobody is accidentally getting more than what they're getting. So these are some challenges that we should constantly think about, while we also make it convenient for the patients to use and for them to get maximum benefit.
Sorry. Is it? Is that okay?
I'm done. Okay. So if you're interested in finding out more about us or in joining us and solving solving problems using cool technology, please drop us an email or feel free to find us after this. Thank you guys.
Okay, so again, thank you so much for our 3 speakers today. I have to use this now. Alright, so before we open for a question and answer session, so I think I would like just to make a brief summary of the 2 talks that we had today. So first, Ibu Dr. Asti Widyastuti, she has talked about how the sexual reproductive health issues actually matters for everyone. Right? So although there is no direct apparent link, with the programs that you are actually doing right now, but we actually need to be equipped with the information about these issues. Okay, and then Ibu Dr. Asti also discussed about how traditional gender roles actually brings disadvantage for both genders, right? And then we also discussed a lot about why we actually need to invest on the adolescents, right? Because of course, by discussing this investment on the adolescents, especially on education and socio-emotional development, we can prohibit these adolescents to actually do dangerous things. Yeah? And then for sure the most important thing about why we actually need to invest on adolescents, because we can actually help break the cycles of poverty. Why is that? Because of course wealthy adolescents have the capacity to avoid reproduct or address better about reproductive health issues, whereas the poor ones unfortunately have not. Yeah. So the second talk, Ms. Levana, Sahi and Saji. Alright. Saji. Alright, okay. Right, so they have gratefully presented about their projects established in the Nala Genetics. So what the company is all about. So the companies actually provide an app, like a very digital app for personalized care for localized populations. Yeah. So Ibu Levanasani also discussed how genes can actually give information about how to cure diseases or how to avoid adverse reactions of some particular drugs. And then with Nala Genetics, both Ibu Sani and Saji developed genetic testing tool, and also what should I put it here? So it is a specific app that provides knowledge database and also gather digital health records. Yeah, and then whereas this app can actually provide recommendations for appropriate health treatment and drugs based on your genes. Alright, so again, I think we will spend about how many minutes? 10 or 15? Okay, so 10 or 15 minutes. About 10 minutes, yeah, and then I will open up 3 questions. Any question, guys? So, yes, please introduce yourself and then your program.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I have a question relating to the first topic about reproductive and maybe sex education. Relating to sex education, we believe that most of us here must have believed that it is such a taboo in the Eastern culture, especially for the common people, and it is already a stereotype that it is too liberated for us to teach sex education, especially for children. And based on that, many of people and young generation, they have no understanding of sexual consent, and because their parents believe that sex is only legitimate after marriage, despite realizing that there is a chance of free sex or sex before sex pre-marriage. And because of that, we have a very low access to sex education. And it is controversial due to the influence of globalization. We are more influenced to many kind of culture nowadays, not only our own culture, not only the Eastern culture. So my point here is it correct enough to go on with the conservativeness while neglecting the sexual safety of the adolescent? Thank you.
That's good. Alright, so I will open 2 more questions. Pakai bahasa Indonesia juga nggak apa-apa. Okay, so feel free, guys. We have 3 very distinguished speakers here. Yes. Oh, cewek semua nih, yang cowok mana?
Oke, terima kasih atas kesempatannya. Nama saya Vika, saya dari jurusan DKV Animasi. Saya ingin bertanya soal seks edukasi. Ini memang ya ada kaitannya dengan itu. Indonesia kan ya konservatif seperti teman saya bilang tadi. Pastinya ya ada hal-hal yang di barat itu boleh, tapi di sini itu tidak. Salah satunya aborsi. Nah, menurut Ibu, apakah aborsi itu bisa jadi salah satu cara untuk membantu menurunkan teenage pregnancy atau kayak ibu-ibu atau remaja yang mungkin consent to sex tapi istilahnya nggak peduli dengan konsekuensinya karena mungkin ada hal tertentu yang membuat dia masih belum bisa merawat anak, yang tentunya kondisi tersebut dapat juga mempengaruhi kondisi anak tersebut sehingga mereka memutuskan untuk aborsi. Karena di sini kan banyak fetus atau anak bayi yang dilahirkan tapi dibuang ke danau atau ditinggalkan di rumah orang dan begitu. Ya, mungkin itu saja dari saya. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih. Okay. Now we have a guy.
mempunyai pertanyaan yang cukup jelas. Saya banyak ya khawatirnya tuh masalah di Indonesia termasuk ini banyaknya pelecehan seksual. Itu gimana masalahnya tuh cepat selesai? Cara pencegahannya itu gimana? Cara pelecehan seksual itu maksudnya apa? Apa itu pelecehan seksual?
Okay. Alright, so we have 3 questions right now, but most of the all of the questions are directed to the first speaker. So I think can I include just one more question directed to the second speaker? Alright, okay. So again, I think I'm very much interested in to learn more about this genetic testing tool. Yeah, just to what do you call it? Sort of provide more information about how your app is going to work. So could you also, sort of describe how you can get that genes from, say, your potential customer, and then how you actually deal with that data privacy of that genes?
Okay. Appreciation to the Fana and Sasi. I also really enjoy your presentation. And again, I realized and I also reflecting that kita bisa di Indonesia, kita ke depan sangat bisa untuk mengatasi banyak permasalahan ketika kita kerja multi-sektoral dan multi-level. Baik dari, kalau teman-teman perhatikan, saya presentasi sangat di area sosial dan tingkat negara, pemenuhan hak. Dan kita juga punya banyak sekali yang menjanjikan dari sisi manusianya dan lebih dalam lagi ke sisi genetik ya, ketika kita bicara tentang DNA. Teman-teman, I would explain in bahasa because it will be quicker. Ada 3 pertanyaan, tapi saya akan menjawabnya bersama-sama. Jadi memang ada banyak sekali miskonsepsi atau pemahaman yang salah tentang sexual education. Orang pikir ketika kita memberikan sexual education, kita mengajari orang berhubungan seks, dan itu salah, ya. Karena ketika kita belajar tentang sex education, kita sebenarnya berbicara tentang kita mengenal tubuh kita bisa memberikan consent, kita bisa menolak, kita bisa memilih untuk melakukan hubungan seksual atau tidak, atau jauh sebelum hubungan seksual kita juga bisa memilih dengan siapa kita akan berrelasi, bagaimana kita akan punya relasi yang setara dan sehat misalnya. So itu semua sebenarnya bagian dari pendidikan seks. Dan data dari seluruh dunia, di Eropa, di Australia, termasuk di Asia Pasifik, dari berbagai riset itu menunjukkan pendidikan seks yang komprehensif, bukan yang parsial atau yang menakut-nakuti. It's not fear-based, it's not segmented sexual education, tapi sexual education yang komprehensif itu justru hasilnya sangat-sangat positif. Ini di seluruh dunia ya, konsisten hasilnya. Karena apa? Orang akan lebih mungkin, more likely, untuk menunda seksual debut atau seks pertama kali. Orang akan mempunyai pasangan yang lebih sedikit, atau ketika punya pasangan dia akan menunda hubungan seks, dan kalaupun dia berhubungan seks dia akan melakukannya dengan perlindungan. So they will do protective sex. Itu hasil yang konsisten dari semua penelitian di dunia tentang pendidikan seks yang komprehensif. Tapi again, di Indonesia kita masih dealing dengan masalah itu, teman-teman. Yang kawan-kawan sebutkan tadi sangat valid. Itu masalah yang sebenarnya kita, pemerintah kita pun masih terus pikirkan sampai sekarang, dan kadang-kadang belum keluar jalan keluarnya. Jalan keluarnya ada, tapi langsung di-challenge sama kaum konservatif. Ya, karena semua pembicaraan tentang seks dianggap against the norm, kayak teman-teman bilang tabu, sehingga banyak kebijakan yang sebenarnya sudah harusnya memberikan pendidikan kesehatan seksual reproduksi yang komprehensif, tapi tidak berhasil dijalankan dengan baik. Dan akhirnya interpretasi tentang pendidikan seks itu pun lebih banyak melarang remaja untuk hubungan seks. That's it. Padahal bukan itu poinnya, ya. Dan kita tahu ketika dilarang orang nggak akan berhenti. Ada banyak hal di balik itu yang justru harus dipahami remaja untuk dia sendiri yang memutuskan untuk dia menghindari perilaku beresiko. Itu sebenarnya yang kita lebih butuh. Itu tentang pentingnya sex education, dan memang kita sudah waktunya untuk klaim. Teman-teman sangat diundang untuk ikut bersama-sama klaim this rights. Ini bagian dari hak kita untuk pendidikan dan untuk informasi yang benar, termasuk untuk akses ke kesehatan, ya. Jadi berlawanan dengan apa yang terjadi di tren yang teman-teman sudah bilang, dan memang benar-benar valid bahwa kita semakin konservatif. Angka IMS, infeksi menular seksual, dan HIV dan kehamilan yang tidak direncanakan terus meningkat seperti yang saya sudah tunjukkan tadi. Jadi kalau kita nggak mengubah sistem pendidikan kita, angka itu nggak akan berubah, ya. Jadi memang sudah waktunya untuk berbicara. Meskipun saya tahu ada banyak challenge, dan untuk itulah inovasi maupun dukungan teman-teman semua sebagai yang FIFA juga sangat dibutuhkan. Nah, pertanyaan tentang aborsi. Sebenarnya aborsi itu adalah terminologi istilah yang sudah banyak sekali di stigma. Orang banyak hubungkan dengan hal-hal yang negatif, dengan soal nilai, dengan soal norms, dengan soal values. Padahal sebenarnya aborsi adalah artinya sesederhana berhentinya kehamilan secara sengaja maupun tidak sengaja ketika kehamilan berumur di bawah 20 minggu atau janin baru berat janin itu di bawah 500 gram. Jadi itu istilah aborsi, itu artinya sesederhana itu saja. Nah, aborsi yang tidak aman, ya, penghentian kehamilan yang tidak aman di Indonesia menyumbang angka kematian ibu yang sangat tinggi. Nah, inilah masalahnya, ya. Tapi sebenarnya kalau aborsi yang aman untuk level tertentu sebenarnya sangat masih diizinkan di Indonesia. Hukum kita, Undang-Undang Kesehatan bilang bahwa aborsi bisa dilakukan untuk korban perkosaan atau kelainan janin dan gangguan kesehatan ibu yang berat, ya. Jadi tidak semata-mata semuanya ilegal di Indonesia, legal tapi restriktif. Tapi saya pengen kita hati-hati untuk, selagi saya setuju bahwa aborsi aman, akses itu penting buat perempuan dan kesehatannya, sehingga mereka tidak pergi ke aborsi yang tidak aman, kedukun, dan kemudian meninggal. Tapi menurut saya, dan untuk kemudian mengembangkan aksesnya menjadi sangat penting, tapi menurut saya kalau kita mau menghindari adolescent pregnancy, kita mundur lagi sedikit. Kemana? Ke pendidikan seks yang komprehensif tadi, lalu memberikan akses untuk kontrasepsi buat remaja yang aktif seksual. Karena tidak semua remaja, seperti yang teman-teman sudah bilang tadi, meskipun mereka belum menikah, itu kemudian tidak berhubungan seksual. Ada banyak sekali kasus, ada banyak sekali riset yang menunjukkan bahwa banyak remaja dengan kehamilan meskipun belum menikah. Jadi kalau mau menurunkan adolescent fertility rate yang tadi saya bilang, kehamilan yang di remaja termasuk yang tidak diinginkan, caranya sederhana: tingkatkan pendidikan seksualitas, tingkatkan akses remaja ke layanan kesehatan seksual reproduksi daripada dilarang-larang. Larang-larang, nakut-nakutin nggak pernah berhasil, ya. Fear-based approach tidak pernah berhasil. Tapi kalau kita kasih mereka bekal tentang knowledge, mereka juga punya akses untuk melindungi dirinya. Angka kematian ibu, adolescent fertility rate itu sangat-sangat bisa diturunkan. Dan yang terakhir tentang harassment adalah ketika kita menerima perlakuan atau ungkapan yang membuat kita tidak nyaman yang karena dikaitkan dengan seksualitas kita ataupun gender kita, ya, menjadi perempuan atau menjadi laki-laki. Kebanyakan menjadi perempuan yang mengalami, meskipun tidak tertutup kemungkinan pada laki-laki. Dan bagaimana mencegahnya? Sebenarnya di sini poin yang sangat penting. Saya sangat senang dengan 3 pertanyaan ini, termasuk pertanyaan yang terakhir, karena selama ini kita agak salah strategi. Karena yang sering mengalami seksual harassment perempuan, yang diajari, yang disasar, yang diadres selalu perempuan. Dan kita masih kurang ngomong untuk ngajak laki-laki untuk kita edukasi. Jadi kita sering sekali bilang, perempuan jangan keluar malam, perempuan jangan pakai baju seksi, perempuan hati-hati harus jaga pergaulan, tapi kita tidak mengajarkan laki-laki untuk menghormati perempuan, untuk tidak memperkosa, untuk tidak sweet-sweetin perempuan ketika perempuan itu, dan untuk menghormati ketika perempuan gak nyaman, dia tidak melakukan apa yang dia lakukan. Jadi cara mencegahnya adalah mengajarkan tentang konsen, tentang menghormati laki-laki dan perempuan, tentang mengetahui mengetahui bagaimana peran gender tradisional yang saya jelaskan tadi itu kadang-kadang membuat laki-laki dan perempuan menjadi dalam posisi tertentu yang tidak diinginkan. Laki-laki didorong untuk menggoda, ya, dan itu kemudian sebenarnya tidak selalu berarti laki-laki ini menggoda, tapi karena dia didorong oleh peersnya bahwa oke, kamu harus colek perempuan itu, kamu harus godain perempuan itu, dari yang level seperti itu sampai di level gender. Jadi itu ya teman-teman, gimana cara mencegahnya? Salah satunya juga adalah tentang edukasi seks. Dan pertanyaan pertama tentang pendidikan seks yang komprehensif itu juga ngomong tentang bagaimana kita menghormati laki-laki dan perempuan, bahkan dari anak-anak, remaja dan remaja. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Dokter.
Terima kasih atas pertanyaannya. I think it's very important also having a look here. So kalau genetic testing itu kita nggak perlu pakai darah, jadi sebenarnya mirip kayak tes darah, so it's very similar to a blood test. But instead of taking your blood, because your DNA is technically anywhere in your body, we take your buccal swab, jadi kayak CCTV itu pakai cotton bud, and then we put it in a tube and then we send it to a lab. Kita kerjasama sama labnya so we can run our reagents and software, and then they can make the report that can be given to you and your doctor. So the whole process takes about 1 to 5 days. And in terms of the second question was related to data privacy. So our knowledge base or our software is actually a cloud-based platform, and Sashi will tell you some of the measures that we're taking in terms of data privacy.
So with respect to data privacy and to keep the patient's data safe, we make sure that all our data is only accessible by us. So if you try to access our database from the internet, you cannot. And we store very little information on the mobile device itself because it is very prone to hacking. You cannot, especially for older patients, you cannot really control what apps they download. There could be apps which are stealing data from the phones, or asking for excessive permissions to get every data, get access to everything on the storage device on the phone or other things, which is something we cannot control, and we cannot really educate older patients especially on what they should and what they should not download. And it opens up a whole host of phishing attacks, malware. There's a lot of things. So we try to store as much as possible on the cloud, but we also make sure that only the patient can choose who they want to share the data to. And as much as possible, we don't identify the patient by their phone number, name, or anything that can trace back to the patient itself. We de-identify the patient's genetic data from the patient's other personally identifiable data. This is also actually one of the key requirements to be compliant with this law called HIPAA, which is kind of the gold standard for pretty much every software-based healthcare solution. It is an American law, but it is also followed by every other place, irrespective of country. Yeah, so we make sure that people inside the lab who actually have the DNA swabs and everything do not know who the patient is. And the people in the hospital do not really know what's happening inside the lab. So we make sure there is a barrier in between. And probably the only guy who knows whose sample is what is me, and I don't understand the medical aspects of it. My focus is only on the software, so I cannot understand the results by just looking at it. So we kind of isolate both the lab side and the hospital side, and by stopping access to each side, we also make sure there is no chance of people forging the data, or one person's DNA sample being tampered with or sent sent somewhere else. And because we control the entire process, like I said, it is important for us to make sure it's convenient, but also keep data privacy and things at the top of our heads every single time.
All right, thank you. I think I would like to also pose just one more question. is from our BINUS online learning programs. Yeah, so I think I'll just pick one question. The question is actually, so how the government relates to any of this. So I think I would like to probably address the questions better. So in terms of Ibu, Dr. Asti, I mean, like, how do you think our government, our Indonesian government, actually address these reproductive and health issues? And then for Ibu Levanasani, so how do you think our government, like the Indonesian government, will actually, accept this, kind of a new trend in the healthcare, solution?
Oke, pemerintah kita sangat serius untuk menghadapi masalah ini, tapi tidak punya semua dukungan yang diperlukan. Jadi sekali lagi ini panggilan untuk teman-teman berbagi peran, termasuk berbagi kreativitas, inovasi untuk membantu pemerintah kita. Pemerintah kita sudah aware bahwa permasalahan kesehatan seksual reproduksi ini permasalahan yang besar. Angka kematian ibu, bagaimana itu diturunkan sudah menjadi perhatian agar menjadi indikator keberhasilan pembangunan dari waktu ke waktu. Jadi itu salah satu tanda bahwa pemerintah kita serius mengatasinya. Tapi kemudian kita juga tahu ada competing resources, kita masih belum bisa kemudian membangun semua infrastruktur, kita masih membangun akses untuk layanan kesehatan, dan pada saat yang sama membangun sistem kesehatan yang lebih kuat lagi. Jadi kalau in terms of the role of the government, they are really supportive and at the moment is working with international development partners with the awareness that they can do it by themselves. So and young people role and also contribution here is sangat-sangat terbuka. Contohnya pemerintah kita dengan bantuan badan-badan PBB, salah satunya UNFPA contohnya itu mengembangkan pilot-pilot untuk program pendidikan kesehatan seksual reproduksi maupun layanan untuk remaja. Kalau kawan-kawan nanti googling di Jogja ada yang namanya Unala, itu mencoba mendekatkan sedekat mungkin layanan kesehatan seksual reproduksi ke remaja. Dan ini kemudian lagi coba direplikasi di tempat lain. UNICEF punya Lollipop, sama layanan kesehatan yang friendly yang tidak akan judging ketika teman-teman masih muda tapi sudah seksual aktif, ketika teman-teman mungkin datang dari populasi kunci, sex worker, men who have sex with men, injecting drug user. Jadi sudah ada layanan yang sudah dipersiapkan dan sekarang akan direplikasi untuk tempat yang lebih luas di Indonesia. Tapi having said that, tantangan masih ada, konservatisme yang teman-teman bilang tadi, sehingga kadang-kadang pemerintah kita pun mengalami tantangan dalam implementasinya. Itulah kenapa kemudian kerja sama multi pihak, collaboration itu sangat penting, dan juga untuk melihat masalah dari multi level. Jadi melihat ini sebagai masalah bukan kesehatan saja, tapi juga masalah pendidikan, masalah kemiskinan, masalah kependudukan, dan juga masalah teknologi. Karena kalau teman-teman menyimak dari presentasi Levana sama Sasha tadi, kita bisa lihat bahwa ada kontribusi yang besar yang bisa kita sumbangkan ketika kita juga main di level nanoteknologi. Ya, jadi ada banyak, mari mulai melihat sebuah masalah dari perspektif yang berbeda-beda, dan saya yakin pemerintah akan sangat terbantu kalau kita melakukan perspektif ini. Karena salah satu tantangan terbesar pemerintah kita sekarang, meskipun perhatiannya sudah sangat bagus, adalah orang masih melihat masalah yang saya presentasikan tadi sebagai masalah Kementerian Kesehatan saja. Sementara itu berhubungan dengan semuanya. Oke. Ya, I think I
Yes, kalau saya dulu juga education juga, and it was an all-girls school. Yeah, so very important. In terms of gimana caranya government untuk sebagai startup di bioteknologi atau medical technology di Indonesia, jadi genetik itu di negara-negara seperti Finland gitu ya, misalnya Finland itu hampir seluruh orang yang tinggal di Finland dan Denmark itu ada genetik informasinya disimpan di negara, karena mereka itu merasa bahwa itu sangat penting untuk mempelajari apa sih tren kesehatan dan apa sebabnya. Ada juga banyak yang bekerja sama dengan perusahaan-perusahaan obat untuk membuat obat yang khusus untuk penyakit-penyakit yang sering terjadi di populasi mereka misalnya. So mungkin itu involve government yang sangat-sangat kuat, tapi untuk Indonesia saat ini tes genetik mungkin pas kita ngobrol sama Kementerian Kesehatan, kita juga udah pernah ke sana, dibilang we don't even have enough beds gitu. Kita rumah sakit aja tempat tidurnya masih nggak ada. Kita mau ngomongin genetik tes apaan gitu kan. Terus habis itu jadi the key is for us as a company is to be supported in two ways. Number one is money, sorry, and then number two is regulatory framework atau enggak laws. Jadi yang pertama itu yang tadi proyeknya di Papua itu sebenarnya itu proyeknya Litbangkes. Jadi kita ada kolaborator di Papua yang memang mendapatkan grant dari pemerintah untuk supaya kita bisa menjalankan pilot itu. Jadi sampai sekarang itu pilotnya akan disebarkan ke Nepal dan India. Jadi that's something that also generates benefits for the government of Indonesia gitu ya. Terus yang kedua masalah regulation itu untuk masalah data safety, right? We don't even know where the data should be hosted. Is it okay for the data to be stored on cloud? Or do you need to have a physical copy in our office? There's no law. It's unclear. And if something goes wrong because there's no law, then it becomes a black Pandora's box. The possibility can be many, and you can be shut down by the government anytime. So I think knowing what the boundaries are is very important for the government to sort of think about as more healthcare technologies and medical technologies are emerging.
Wow, I think, okay, tepuk tangan dulu dong. So I think we have, like very much privilege to have these three speakers to come to Venus today, and then I hope you guys have learned a lot about the topics and the aspects that have been discussed. So again, I think time is up, yeah? So I will return the stage to our MC.
Thank you, Dr. Dia. And also our distinguished guests. If you don't mind, please stand in front so Dr. Dia can pass the token of our appreciation of your contribution and sharing knowledge. Thank you. Master Reza, please be ready for photoshoot. Dr. Asti, representing UNFPA. And Ms. Levana and Mr. Saji, representing Nala Genetics Singapore.